So in Star Wars, the Sith have the rule of 2. But do you know what would be really extreme? If there was a rule of 3 instead. So today, let's take a look at 3 options for using extreme statistics when we are building hazards in Pathfinder 2e on this episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the local disaster tour guide. That's right, I am a storyteller who finally decided he should be wearing a Star Wars shirt because, as we all know by now, it's a trap. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder. Today we are continuing Trap Month in Storytelling in Pathfinder 2e, where we're taking a look at the tips, tricks, and advice that Paizo offers storytellers so that they can successfully use traps inside of their games. This series is intended for storytellers of all skill levels, from beginner to advanced, and even if Pathfinder 2e is not necessarily your preferred game, I still invite you to be a part of the conversation. One of the things that I have learned over the years of storytelling is that when you study a variety of games, you can learn a lot of cool stuff to bring back to your preferred game. So, regardless of your level of experience, or whether or not Pathfinder 2e is your main game, let's talk about building traps in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. So March has been Trap Month in this series. We've been taking a look at how Pathfinder 2nd Edition handles traps, or as we've discussed, the larger rule set is referred to as hazards inside of the game. The first 2 weeks we devoted to how Pathfinder 2e categorizes different types of hazards. We talked about environmental hazards, traps, and haunts. And then last week, we took a look at the very important distinction between simple hazards and complex hazards. But now that we understand how the game categorizes hazards, we're ready to move on to the most entertaining portion of the conversation, which is, how do we actually build hazards? Sure, Pathfinder 2e offers us some fun hazards inside of the core rulebook and the Gamemastery guide that we can certainly access and drop into our games. But I imagine for storytellers everywhere, a lot of the thrill comes with designing your own unique challenges and insane death traps to throw at your players. So today, we're going to be doing just that as we take a look at the specific rules for building hazards that Paizo offers in the Gamemastery Guide for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. However, before we dive into that, let's do all of the YouTube stuff really quick. If you enjoy this video, please like it and share it. Please subscribe to the channel. And most importantly, please be a part of the conversation. I love hearing from you all. I love getting your insights and feedback. And interacting with my community is the best part of this job. All of that helps feed the algorithm. All of it helps the channel to grow. But most importantly, all of that encourages me as a content creator. Also, speaking of YouTube stuff, sponsor ad. So I want to give a huge shout out today to the sponsor of this video, ArcKnight. ArcKnight is a Texas-based company that makes TTRPG accessories out of beautiful and durable die-cut plastic. They offer products like spell templates, maps, object sheets, and the product that we're advertising today, RPG mini mounts. These are kind of small. Maybe we should go to the map and show you how these work. Okay, so what I want to do first is I want to do a slow pan and show you some of the different cuts that come from the mini mounts at ArcKnight. As you can see, there is a wide variety of options. You've got spiders and horses and unicorns. You've got sea creatures like sea turtles and bears and rhinos. And if I'm being entirely honest, I got the Kickstarter, which includes some Kickstarter exclusive mini mounts, I honestly don't remember which ones are which, but you can see that this collection comes with an incredible variety of creatures that your players can ride into battle. As you can see here, using the mini mounts on your maps is very easy to do. Pawns and figurines will sit very easily on top of your minis, allowing you to quickly demonstrate when your character is mounted or dismounted. And as I've already noted, this collection comes with a variety of different mini mounts that you can use. So as you can see, Ravin our warrior is riding on the back of a black dragon, Ampara has a unicorn, Hoshi the witch picked up a displacer beast somewhere, and even the halfling chef has a giant frog that they are riding into battle. One more thing that I would like to note about the mini mounts is that they come compatible with spaces where you can insert the flat plastic minis from ArcKnight into the mount so they work seamlessly with other ArcKnight products. Now my wife and I do hope to invest in the flat plastic minis eventually, but right now we're using the Pathfinder pawns that Paizo produces, and as you can see, they also work perfectly well with ArcKnight's mount minis. So that's just a quick view of how you can use these products at your gaming table. And I just want to say I have a great deal of respect for ArcKnight, and my wife and I are super excited to be working with them as sponsors for this channel. The die-cut plastic that they use is incredibly durable and beautiful, making for products that are going to last, and you get a lot of product for a very low price. One of my favorite things about ArcKnight products is just how easy it is to store everything that ArcKnight makes. For example, I actually backed the Mini Mounts Kickstarter, and even though I got dozens of mini mounts to use in my campaign, they all fit neatly in this single box. This doesn't take up much room on my shelf, meaning that I have plenty of space for the other accessories in my collection. The last thing I want to say about ArcKnight is this. I have been a customer of ArcKnight for years, and they have an absolutely fantastic team. I've backed their Kickstarters, I've actually gotten to talk to them at Gen Con, and I have done a number of orders through this company, and on the single occasion that an order went wrong, their customer service team was extremely quick to address the problem, fix the problem. I am blown away by the professionalism and courtesy of this company, and they are wonderful to work with. And again, thank you ArcKnight for sponsoring this video. If you want to check out their products, I'll throw a link in the video description below. Alright, so the time has come to dive into the rules for building hazards, but before we do that, I want to give you some reading references so that if you want to dig a little bit deeper on your own, you can do that. Now, for this series, we have been returning to the same pages over and over again. We've been looking at pages 520 to 529 of the Pathfinder 2e core rulebook, as well as pages 74 to pages 81 of the Gamemastery guide for Pathfinder 2e. And pretty much today we're going to be revisiting those pages that we've been looking at for a while now. However, there is some particularly important content that we want to pay attention to. The Gamemastery guide has the specific rules for building hazards in Pathfinder 2e, so the Gamemastery guide pages are the most important pages today. And in particular today, we're going to be talking about reference tables 213, 214, 215, and 216. Those are the tables for determining stealth and disable DCs, the minimum proficiencies necessary for traps, the defensive statistics of traps, and the offensive statistics of traps. So those are going to be very important references that you're going to want to familiarize yourself with when learning how to build a trap in Pathfinder 2e. Also today we're going to be working with a sample trap from the Gamemastery guide, which is called the Titanic Flytrap, and it can be found on page 78 of the Gamemastery guide. One final reference that I would like to throw out, just in case you need this, some traps can be interacted with magically, and that means you will also want to be familiar with the rules for counteracting in Pathfinder 2e, which can be found on pages 458 and 459 of the core rulebook. So that's where you can go to read up on some more in-depth information, but let's get started. Now, there are a couple of different ways that we could go about discussing how to build a trap in Pathfinder 2e, And next week I'm actually going to do a video where I do build some traps for Pathfinder 2e, but I think the best way to understand this process is to actually take a look at a sample trap from Pathfinder 2e, break down that trap, understand how it was constructed using Pathfinder 2e's rules, and then we'll have a good big picture view of what it means to build a trap. So today we're going to be working through the stat block for the level 4 environmental hazard, the Titanic Flytrap, which can be found on page 78 of the Gamemastery guide. Also, I apologize, I couldn't find a good picture of a trap stat block online, so I tried to get the best picture I could with my phone to include in this video. If this is a little bit fuzzy, I do apologize for that, but you can find this stat block in the Gamemastery guide and on Archives of Nethys, link in the video description. So feel free to pull up a copy of this stat block so that you can see exactly what I'm talking about as we go through this stat block so that you can understand what I'm referencing. As we move through this stat block, I'll be referencing some of the different rules, some of the different tables, some of the different information that Paizo gives us so that we can understand exactly how Paizo arrived at, well, this stat block for the Titanic Flytrap. Now, if you saw last week's video on simple versus complex hazards, you should know that the Titanic Flytrap is a simple hazard in Pathfinder 2e. Yes, this monster of a stat block with multiple things that a game master is going to need to track and try to keep up with, this is a simple hazard. Thank you, Paizo. Thank you. I'm sure we could insert some jokes about Paizo editing here. But with any trap stat block in Pathfinder 2e, you're typically going to see it divided into 3 sections. And they don't explicitly tell you what these sections are, but I kind of feel like these sections can be labeled Finding the Trap, Fighting the Trap, and Round 2 with the Trap. So let's start at the very beginning at the top of the stat block where we see some very basic information. We see the name of this trap, the Titanic Flytrap. That's easy enough. And next to it we see a rating of Hazard Level 4. Again, this is pretty straightforward, and from a storyteller perspective, helps us to understand what kind of threat this trap would be, and also how much experience we might want to award if our players successfully survive or overcome this particular hazard. Directly under the name, you will see a trait box for the Titanic Flytrap which says Environmental, which means that this hazard is an environmental hazard. The 3 most common traits for traps are Environmental, Trap, or Haunt. So with any stat block, you're going to see one of those 3 traits here. Sometimes you will see traits as well indicating whether the trap is magical or mechanical, and if the hazard is complex, it will also have a trait noting that it is a complex hazard in this particular section. Next up, we see the Stealth DC for the Titanic Flytrap, and this is the DC of any perception roll that your players might need to make if they want to notice the Titanic Flytrap before it's too late. Beside that, you'll see the word Trained in parentheses, which is the minimum proficiency that somebody needs to be able to find this trap. Now, it is worth noting, if there is nothing in parentheses here, that means there is no minimum proficiency to find that trap, and whoever walks into the area with the trap is entitled to a perception check to try and locate it. However, if a trap does have a minimum proficiency like the Titanic Flytrap does, characters are only entitled to that perception check if they are using the search activity when exploring an area. So even though Stealth DC 25 Trained is a pretty short line of text, there's a lot of information packed into this small area. The next portion of the stat block is the description of the trap, which gives you an idea of what the trap looks like visually, either at rest, in action, or most often both. In this particular case, the description is going to give us a little bit of what the trap looks like when you first encounter it, and then what the trap actually looks like when it springs into action. And all of this taken together is what I refer to as the Finding the Trap portion of the stat block. Now, a couple of quick nuances here. If you're dealing with a complex hazard instead of a simple hazard, instead of a stealth DC, you will have a stealth skill that the trap uses when it rolls initiative. So instead of stealth DC 25, you might see something that says stealth plus 15. And that just tells you what the trap's initiative modifier is should it roll initiative. Now this is a small quirk of the rules, and if you're familiar with Pathfinder 2e, you can figure this out very easily, but this could be a little confusing if you're looking at a complex stat block. If a complex stat block has stealth plus 15, that's the initiative modifier of the trap, but what is the stealth DC of the trap? Well, in Pathfinder 2e, a DC is always the normal modifier of a creature or thing plus 10, so stealth plus 15, if you need that stealth DC, the stealth DC would be 25. Again, that's one of those, if you're familiar with 2e, you can do that math very easily, but when you first look at a complex trap, that portion of the stat block might throw you off if you're not actively thinking about it. Now, when you're building out your own trap in Pathfinder 2e, there's a couple of tables that you're going to be referencing for this section, and that's tables 213 and 214, which talk about stealth and disable DCs and minimum proficiencies for traps. These are found on page 75 of the Gamemastery guide, and they basically tell you the numbers or information to plug in based on what you're wanting to do with a given trap. So for stealth and disable DCs, you'll want to figure out what level the trap is, and then decide if you want the stealth or disable DC to be an extreme DC, a high DC, or a low DC, and then you'll just plug the appropriate numbers in. In this case, the Titanic Flytrap is a level 4 hazard, and if we were to check the building hazards information, we would discover that the stealth DC for a Titanic Flytrap is an extreme DC for a level 4 hazard. And this brings us to an important point on building traps. I like to call it the extreme rule of 3. Normally, when you're building stuff in Pathfinder 2e, you don't want to use extreme DCs or extreme damage or extreme basically anything. Extreme is meant to be kind of the outer limits of a particular range of numbers that might show up in play. But there is an exception, and that's when we build hazards. Pathfinder 2e kind of assumes that you will actually use extreme numbers in at least one of 3 places when you are building a hazard. Hazards can have an extreme stealth DC, an extreme disable DC, or an extreme save DC, or potentially attack modifier. Think of it this way. Because traps are not quite as complex and dangerous as creatures, they can more freely use extreme numbers because theoretically your players are not going to interact with them as often or for as long. And when you are building a trap, typically speaking, you want to make one of 3 things extreme. You want to make it extremely hard to find, or extremely hard to disable, or extremely hard to avoid. So in this case, they made the Titanic Flytrap extremely hard to find. Now the disable DC and the escape DC that we're going to talk about later, they use lower numbers for those things because in this choice they decided to make the extreme portion of the trap the finding the trap portion of the encounter. So just bear in mind when you're building your trap, you get to use one extreme number, and the best place to use that extreme number is going to be stealth DC, disable DC, or save DC, and again save DC can possibly be attack rolls depending on if we're talking about simple or complex hazards. The other table that we want to reference for this section is the minimum proficiency section, which tells us the minimum skill proficiencies that are going to be necessary to find or interact with a given trap. And they give us 2 different columns here. One is a high threat encounter, one is a moderate threat encounter, and it's just going to recommend to you if players should be trained or expert or master or maybe even legendary if they want to successfully find or disable a given trap. This is a pretty straightforward table, but for this section you're going to use tables 213 and 214 to fill in the stealth DC, the required proficiencies, and then the rest of this section will be filled in with the description that you've given your trap, with the name that you've given your trap, and with the appropriate traits that your hazard happens to have. But now that we have finished the first section, which is finding the trap, we move on to the second section, which is kind of the dealing with the trap section, which is going to deal with the defensive and offensive statistics associated with the trap. And this is kind of the main body of the stat block. It's also the majority of critical information that you're going to be using when running a hazard encounter. Now in this section, you are going to use table 213 again, because disable DCs are going to be part of this section of the stat block. And you're also going to be pulling information from tables 215 and 216 to help fill in some of the defensive and offensive statistics associated with your hazard. Now you will notice at the start of this section, we have a disabled DC listed for the Titanic Flytrap of a DC 22 survival check and an associated proficiency of trained. Also, beside this, we have a description of how a character might successfully disable the Titanic Flytrap, and this is one of my favorite things that Pathfinder 2e does. I think it is a very good idea to kind of write out beside the disable section how a character could go about disabling a given hazard. This isn't just useful from a narrative setting the scene and telling the story perspective. It can also allow you to reward your players when they're doing a good job thinking creatively on their feet. If a player identifies the ideal way to disable a trap, maybe you can give them a circumstance bonus on the roll or possibly pass out a hero point. I think this small bit of descriptive text can really enhance the role-playing side of the conversation, so don't skip out on it. Next, we get the AC, Fortitude save, and Reflex save of the Titanic Flytrap. And basically, these become relevant if your characters decide that they want to attack the Flytrap, or if they want to cast a spell on the Flytrap. These are the appropriate statistics for those instances. Underneath that, you'll find a listed HP for the Titanic Flytrap, as well as a broken threshold, much like the broken threshold that you would find for objects such as a shield. And much like objects, if a hazard takes enough damage that they drop below that broken threshold, the hazard is broken. It doesn't function, and effectively, your characters are safe from whatever it might do. However, if the hazard still has HP, it can still be repaired and might become functional again at a later date. Beside the HP and broken threshold, you'll also find some listed immunities and resistances for the Titanic Flytrap. In this case, it is immune to anything with the mental trait, which kind of makes sense for what we're dealing with here. The majority of hazards are going to be immune to anything mental. And then we also see that it has a resistance to acid damage and fire damage. Now, we don't have time to go into the full rules on attacking traps here, but one thing that is very important to remember is Pathfinder 2e notes that attacking a hazard will almost certainly trigger that hazard if the attack doesn't break the hazard. So if a player wants to try to hack at the Titanic Flytrap and potentially destroy it, they need to basically remove half of its health in one attack, or that Flytrap's going to snap shut. By the way, it's not listed in this particular stat block, but most hazards will have a hardness of some kind, and it will be found in this particular section as well, and will interact with the HP and broken threshold like any other object. Beneath these defensive statistics, we then see the offensive statistics for the Titanic Flytrap. We see the snap shut reaction that it uses when triggered. We also see its melee strike, which is a jaw strike, that has the devour effect, and I'm not going to read everything on devour, but you can see that easily enough in the stat block, and I want to point out that escape DC of 21 that the devour effect incurs, as well as the Titanic Flytrap toxin that a character might be exposed to, which also has a DC of 21. So you kind of see a priority with this particular hazard. Its extreme DC is associated with noticing the hazard, and then it's a little bit easier to disable. If you fail to disable it and actually get caught in its jaws, the DC to escape, the DC to fight off the paralytic toxin is a little bit lower than that. But all of these are associated with the offensive statistics of the Titanic Flytrap, And when it comes to defense and offense, tables 215 and 216 are where you're going to find the majority of this information. Much like the previous two tables that we've discussed in this video, these tables are divided by level, so you would start with the appropriate level for whatever hazard you're building, and then you basically would read across the table and pull the appropriate numbers off of the table and place them into the stat block. And one thing that is important to note is these tables are going to have extreme numbers, high numbers, and low numbers, reflecting the different levels that statistics might fall into. So you could imagine with the Titanic Flytrap that if you wanted to switch this trap up a little bit, you could take the low offensive numbers and maybe push them up to extreme, but then turn around and take that extreme stealth DC that we saw earlier and make it a very low stealth DC, and that would create a trap that is easier to spot, but much more dangerous if you fall into it. They do a good job of giving you a range of numbers that you can really customize to turn a trap into the specific encounter that you want to build. And by the way, if you don't want to build an entire trap, you can play around with the traps in the core rulebook and the Gamemastery guide by switching around some of these numbers. You can get very different experiences by just kind of playing with those simple details. But obviously, you can also go all in and build your own trap and put your own numbers in based on what works best in your campaign. Now, one special thing we get to talk about here is on table 216, the offensive statistic tables. You will notice that they have information for simple hazards and complex hazards. And that's because, well, simple hazards hit harder, complex hazards are more likely to hit more often. Basically, the statistics for a simple hazard are typically going to be about twice as damaging and about +2 to attack relative to a complex hazard at the same level. And the reason for this is a simple hazard is typically going to be fires off once and that's all that happens, whereas a complex hazard is going to play out over several rounds and therefore might deal damage several times. So bear in mind, if you're dealing with a simple hazard, you probably get to drive those numbers up, and if you're dealing with a complex hazard, you probably need to take those numbers down a little bit to get them to balance out properly. But again, these tables give you some very clear numbers and guidelines, so you can really just plug in whatever is appropriate to the situation that you're designing. Now, they don't have it in this particular stat block, but when you are dealing with a complex hazard, another portion of the stat block is the routine that is associated with the hazard, and if a hazard has a routine, the routine will be found in this section of the stat block as well. But now we get to move on to the last section of the stat block, and typically this section of the stat block is only going to have one piece of information, which is, does this trap reset, and if it resets, how does it happen? How often does it happen? With the Titanic Flytrap, we see that it will naturally reset about an hour after it eats, although if it eats a particularly large meal, and most player characters probably qualify, it might take longer for the Titanic Flytrap to reset back to normal. But basically, this is the section of the stat block that tells you how long the players have to wait before this becomes problematic again. So, this is a pretty easy section. But now that we've been through all of that, that is what a stat block for a trap looks like in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. We've talked about the different components, we've talked about how to use tables 213, 214, 215, and 216 to fill out these different components, and we can see very clearly how Paizo used this information in constructing this particular trap. You can take a look at any trap in the core rulebook or the Gamemastery guide, and you're going to see a very similar philosophy playing out. But we'll go ahead and pause the conversation for now, and next week we'll pick this conversation back up when I build 2 hazards based on the suggestions that you all have been giving me. So let me turn the conversation over to you. Do you have any questions about how to construct a stat block for a hazard in Pathfinder 2e? If you do, let me know in the comments down below. And if there's anything that I missed in this conversation, leave that for me down there as well. If you enjoyed this video, like it, share it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and you should definitely go and check out the sponsor for this video, ArcKnight. Thank you so much for being here, thank you so much for being a part of the conversation, and have a wonderful day.